Hello, everybody. How are you? Welcome to the third Dean's Honor Symposium. My name is Laura Palermo, and I have had the pleasure of working with these fantastic students on their presentations for you today. I would like to thank first Dean Stephanie Browner and the Dean's Office for putting together this symposium. In my opinion, there is nothing better than being proud of your work. Nothing better than to be able to show it to others and to be celebrated for it. And I think that this symposium provides all of these opportunities. So thank you very much for organizing this. I would like to thank especially Jennifer Riegel, Associate Director of Strategic Communication and Special Programs, for all her constant help and support. And Jen made this experience for us as smooth as possible. There are panels today here at 1:15, 2:30, and 3:45. This is the whole lecture hall, and there's also panels in next door, Star Foundation Hall. So please check your program for panel location. Marius, Maren, and Cassidy come from different areas of study and years in their academic careers, and we've been working together since January to develop this panel on global migration. I'm sure you will enjoy it very much. And so we will have the 4 presentations, and after the presentations, the panelists will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. This presentation will end in 1 hour, so we can allow the transition for the next panel. Please welcome our panelists.
Okay. So hello, everyone. Thank you for coming here today. My name is Mario Pavlakis. I study economics and global studies here at Lang. I'm a junior. And yes.
Hi, I'm Cassidy Nelson. I'm a senior at Lang, and I study global studies and Hispanic studies.
Hi, my name is Maren Hurley-Matz. I am a rising senior in the Global Studies Department and the Race and Ethnicity Studies Department.
Hi, I'm Mohanty. I'm majoring in politics and minoring in screen studies.
Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you again for coming here today. So the name of our panel is called Migration, Navigating International Borders and Local Spaces. And my project is called the Integration Program, which is a policy reform to the integration of Syrian refugees in Greece. So I'm going to briefly talk to you about the Syrian refugee crisis in general, then in Greece, and then I will talk to you about my project specifically. So the Syrian conflict has created the worst humanitarian crisis of our time. Half the country's pre-war population, more than 11 million people, have been killed or forced to flee their homes. Anti-government demonstrations began in March of 2011 as part of the Arab Spring, but the peaceful protests quickly escalated after the government's violent crackdown and armed opposition groups began fighting back. In July of the same year, army defectors had loosely organized the Free Syrian Army, and many civilian Syrians took up arms to join the opposition. Divisions between secular and religious fighters and between ethnic groups continued to complicate the politics of the conflict. So according to the United Nations, more than 6.1 million people are internally displaced, 1.8 million of whom were newly displaced in 2017. According to the Human Rights Watch, 6,550 people are being displaced each day, and more than 1.5 million people have already fled to Jordan and Lebanon, whereas more than 3.3 million people have fled across the border into Turkey. So then I'm moving on to the current situation in Greece. Statistics vary. According to the International Rescue Committee, the current Syrian refugee population in Greece is 60,000, whereas the Greek government and the UN report that it is around 48,000. But so the Greek government has so far moved more than 7,000 asylum seekers from the islands to the mainland. But the problem is that 5,000 people have arrived since December, something that has added to the already overcrowded island camps. The island camps are in the islands of Lesbos, Chios, Samos, Leros, and Kos, and they're being called hotspots specifically because there is that sense of containing refugees to those islands specifically. So the word hotspots reflects the current policy there. And the main problem is that the total capacity of those refugee camps is for 6,292 people, but currently there are 10,000 people in those facilities. So at the same time, as many of you might be aware, the economic crisis in Greece is still present, thus creating less future opportunities to refugees to rebuild their lives. There's a lack of job opportunities that makes many Greeks skeptical of their own future, and thus makes them feeling fear of losing their jobs to refugees. The crisis has led to reduced government spending, thus creating less support for the refugees. So here I have a couple of experiences that refugees shared. I'm not going to read all of them, but what they mainly express is that they are deeply dissatisfied with the living conditions in the refugee camps. At many refugee camps, the conditions are just not for humans to live there, and they're also afraid that they won't be able to sustain their lives if they stay in Greece. They see the economic crisis as a huge reason for them to try to go to other European countries where they could start rebuilding their lives. So the main policy framework that exists currently in Greece and Europe is called ESTIA, stands for Emergency Support, Integration and Accommodation, but in Greek it means home. And ESTIA was instituted in July of 2017 with a budget of 209 million euro, approximately 245 million US dollars. And so what ESTIA wanted to do was to use that money for refugees, to support refugees. And so we decided to distribute that money through the chapter of UNHCR in Athens. So the UNHCR in Athens distributes that money through local NGOs. As of November 2017, 36,135 households were receiving cash assistance. And according to UNHCR, all eligible asylum seekers and refugees were being represented. At the same time, 18,927 accommodation places had been created, but the goal was 22,000. But the main problem here that creates a lot of debate back in Greece and in Europe in general is that ESTIA is planned to transition to the Greek public authorities and eventually become a part of the Greek welfare system, something that it's very interesting to see how it is going to be implemented, because the Greek government would not be able to sustain such a program of that scale. 2 months ago, ESTIA also gave out to UNHCR in Athens another 180 million euro. So that means that the need for refugees is constantly there. Another important policy, which serves as an extension of ESTIA, is called the Greek Cash Alliance, which is a partnership between UNHCR and 5 international non-governmental organizations for them to provide cash assistance to refugees. What it needs to be understood is that the refugee population in Greece is very mobile. That means that they won't stay to refugee camps for quite some time, so they tend to go throughout the country, especially towards the north, to the northern borders of the country, for them to find a solution and continue to the rest of the Europe. So what happened here is that the Greek Cash Alliance partnered with Prepaid Financial Services in partnership with MasterCard, and thus they created a single database. That means that if refugees were admitted for cash and private housing assistance, they will be able to have the same even if they are at a different city in Greece. Whereas before that, if they were registered with an NGO in an island, they couldn't do the same when they would go, for example, to another city in Greece. So that was also a very important policy. But there are definitely many issues with the current policy framework. The main one is that there is lack in proper preparation of the refugees. There is lack in integration efforts. And I personally, as an individual, as a student, I see that housing and money should be the starting point of the integration discussion rather than the end goal. So another problem is that it takes approximately 4 to 5 months for enrollment into the cash program after their application has been filed, and it takes another 4 to 5 months for enrollment into the housing program. And another issue is, of course, the eligibility criteria for cash and housing, because refugees need to provide a valid address, either one of a shelter, government-provided site, or private housing, which again creates a lot of issues since the population is very mobile within the country. Another key issue that Greece is definitely responsible for that, and also Europe as a whole, is that the asylum seeking process is very slow. There's a lot of backlog in processing asylum applications. And as of September 2017, according to Eurostat, 44,285 applications were pending. If you look at those numbers compared to the fact that the population is, according to the UN, 48,000, that means that pretty much non-application has been properly looked at. So my project is called the Integration Program, and it is a policy paper, advocacy paper that I decided to start working on after I visited refugee camps in the islands of Lesbos with the American Embassy of Athens, where I was working before I transferred here to the new school. And so we visited those camps, and that was probably one of the greatest experiences that I've ever had, one that had a big impact on me as an individual. And so last September, I decided to start working on such a paper. And so my paper is going to address specifically effective exit ramps from the refugee camps to the Greek society. What I specifically want to address is that program should be implemented by the Greek government when ESTIA, as a European program, is going to become part of the Greek welfare system. And the importance here is that there needs to be that integration program that will specifically address women, who are the most marginalized group, refugee group currently. And also I need to mention that refugee women consist more than the half of the population. So they are women and children are 37,000 currently at the refugee population. And so the integration program is going to be a yearly long program, which is going to consist of 6 months of theoretical and vocational training that would consist from Greek language classes to computer classes, classes on the empowerment of social skills, class that will help them better understand the Greek society, and also there is going to be legal support on issues of Greek employment, workshops on job searching, resume building, and of course vocational training such as cooking seminars or sewing and other types of vocational training. And then after that 6-month period, there needs to be a professional placement, which is going to be a collaboration with local employees for work placement, and also there needs to be close monitoring of the beneficiary. For example, making sure that the women that will be part of that program, they would feel comfortable in the place that they are working for. That program already exists. There is a similar version of that program that has been instituted by a small NGO in Greece, which is called Metadrasi, but they specifically focus on unaccompanied minors, whereas I think that it's very important here to address women, and the reasons are the fact that women, if women need to become equipped so as to face a new life in Greece, and also women are the demographic that have experienced the most trauma, so there need to be counseling sessions that will help them overcome the trauma and anxiety. And also it's very important to understand that while you're waiting for a year to get either the cash or the housing assistance, or even learn news from your application, you need to have a reason in your life, you need to have a goal in your life. There are many statistics that have proven that many people commit suicide, many refugees commit suicide in the islands because they feel that there is no progress in their lives. So such a program is very important, and what we also need to understand is that women are able to pass down their knowledge and their experiences to their children. So thus, if women get that sense of belonging, they would be able to pass down that same feeling to their children, thus creating a new incentive for them to stay in Greece and rebuild their lives there. So before I close, I want to give special thanks to the Clinton Global Initiative University that they allowed me to present this project in October last year. And also I want to thank my colleagues back in the US Embassy in Athens, the members of the United Nations Summer Study Program, where we developed a similar policy paper last summer. And I definitely want to thank Christina Dawkins, the director of the Civic Engagement Social Justice Office, Jennifer Rigo for putting together the Dean's Honor Symposium, and of course Professor Palermo for helping us this semester to put together this presentation. Thank you very much, and I'll take all of your questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Maren Hurley-Matz, And I will be talking today about political engagement across immigrant communities that was done as a comparative perspective between Italy and China. So I conducted this fieldwork from January to April of last year, 2017, and I went from Dakar, Senegal, and the holy city of Touba there to Italy and China. This was a collaboration between the School of International Training, which is a graduate research program, and the Al-Maradia Research Institute of Touba, Senegal. The Al-Maradia is the specific branch of Islam that is indigenous to Senegal, and the religious leaders in Touba have formulated this research institute that really is interested in supporting global research efforts, and they were the reason that we were able to get access to these communities and really do the type of ethnography and fieldwork that we did. So I was primarily working with Senegalese married communities throughout Italy and China, but as in most immigrant communities, there were other large groups present that included Egyptian immigrants, Syrian immigrants, Ivorian immigrants, and other people from various countries. And this research was conducted primarily through participant observation, interview, through interpretation, and ethnography. So before I lay out my research questions and hypothesis, there are a few key terms to this work. So naturalization is the process of becoming a citizen in a state where you have not been born, or perhaps you have been born and you are not of a native descent there. I use the term immigrant/migrant because in both Italy and China, while the state views these people as migrants and that they don't have citizenship, they are actually immigrants in that they have formed their lives there, they've lived there, they're integrated within the society as a whole, and contribute to that society. And for the purposes of this project, I'm defining political engagement as active participation in politics and civic matters, regardless of citizenship or the ability to vote. So, for example, voter registration, community organizing, policy development, political protests, and other engagements of this nature. So another key concept here is the principles of jus sanguinis and jus solis. These are the two fundamental schools of thought on who should be a citizen. Jus sanguinis literally translates to right of the blood, and it means that citizenship should be reserved for those who are of native descent or can trace their relationship to a native of that country, versus jus solis, which means the right of the soil, and that means that wherever you are born is where you should be able to obtain citizenship, either through your parent, through physically being born in the country, or through immigrating to that country. And these are generally the organizing principles that are used around the world. We are obviously most familiar with jus solis here in the United States, but in both Italy and China, they use jus sanguinis processes. So my research question was, how does integration of transnational immigrant communities affect the political landscape of host countries in the absence of naturalization processes? And my hypothesis was that non-naturalized immigrant integration and political engagement actually creates freer and more democratic societies, regardless of the integration via citizenship. So in Italy, I was working mostly in Turin, which is up here at the top in the northern region of Italy. It has a pretty large and well-established immigrant community that is due to both Italy being an immigrant hub from the northern and western part of Africa, and also because of France's colonial relationship with West African countries. There's been some migration from France into Italy. So the average length of stay for most immigrants is 40 to 20 years. They are very well integrated. They own businesses, they go to school there, they speak Italian fluently, and there are many second and third generations who have been born in the country. Another thing that I want to highlight is that the immigrant community in Italy is almost all documented. They all have legal paperwork, but they have to renew their visas every 2 years, regardless of how long they've been in the country. So the political integration here is really interesting. Because of this longstanding community, there's been a lot of political activism, largely on the part of students, that is really pushing to change the citizenship laws. As I've mentioned, Italy is a jus sanguinis country, but the student organizing has brought multiple bills to the floor of parliament, and their arguments are that they are Italian in language and in culture. Italy needs diversity to remain economically viable and prosperous, and that community networks have already been established and can act as mediators and alleviate any strain that might be put on the government. This, unfortunately, while an extremely strong argument, has not actually changed the policies so far. Despite multiple bills being brought before the parliament, this argument that Italy continues to be an entrance hub and that in changing the citizen practices will encourage more strain has generally won out, and bills have either been voted down or delayed or canceled. At one point, Parliament was entirely reorganized in order to avoid voting on a bill. But the interesting thing is that these young Italian immigrants continue to engage in these democratic processes, and as a result of the parliamentary reorganization, immigrants now have sort of more political clout in their political system. They've helped to expose corruption and all these other things that really support this idea that Italy is now a freer and more democratic society because of them. But it still has not tangibly affected their lives or their ability to become citizens. The second fieldwork site that I was placed in was Guangzhou, China. So Guangzhou is here in the south central region of China. It is the third largest city in China. It's the capital of Guangdong province, and it is an industrial hub for all of China. Almost everything that is like made and exported in the terms of small consumer goods is exported out of Guangzhou. This community is relatively new. The average stay ranges from 6 months. People just come, they start an import-export business, they leave, all the way up to 10 years. These are people who are becoming more integrated and well invested in the community, but it is a much shorter stay than in Italy. So the interesting relationship between China and many African countries is that China really needs Africa and African resources in order to continue producing the electronic commodities that they're really famous for. So they have started this relationship that primarily benefits China and has in some cases been critiqued as neo-colonialist. But as a part of this relationship, they have extended 6-month visas to many West African, specifically immigrants, in order to come, start business ventures specifically with Chinese partners, and then hypothetically to return to West Africa. So the political activism here has mostly been centered on quality of life and less on naturalization, because there is an expectation that immigrants will return to their lives in their country. But as it turns out, it's very difficult to get another visa once you have already had one. And so if you are running a transnational business, it's actually easier to stay in China on the supply side. So that is why most immigrants end up overstaying their visa and staying in China for multiple years. But political activism is still occurring, and this is really centered on quality of life. So the Hukao system is a system that determines whether you're allowed to live legally in a city, and they have really been a instrumental force in trying to destabilize that and trying to push for a more freer housing practices. They are also the majority of these immigrants are Muslim, and they often end up in solidarity with religious practices with the minority Uyghur population in China and resisting religious oppression. And of course, African immigrants around the world face incredible police brutality, but in China this has been especially rampant. And in China there is not as much of a culture of political protest, but specifically the community in Guangzhou has organized multiple protests against police killing and police brutality, and have actually entered into some negotiations with the Chinese police force there. So my Chinese hypothesis was that due to the relative youth of the community and the transnational intention behind the immigration process, political engagement is not focused as much on citizenship practices, but is still engaging in the political landscape in partnership with political actors in China. And these are still advantageous to the general Chinese society. And there's one other thing that I noticed as a product of this research, which was that these immigrants were able to better harness the idea of the outsider or their international status, which gave them some leverage and a level of protection and social security that I didn't see as much in the Italian context, where they were really having to fight to say, like, we are Italian. They were able to say, I am invested in Chinese society and Chinese life, but I am still Senegalese, or I am still Ivorian, and use that identity to their advantage. Overall, I found that I indeed proved my hypothesis true, which is that I thought that immigrant communities continue to engage politically, and this integration positively affects host societies. But unfortunately, it often does not return as many material benefits for immigrant communities as it does for the host society. I think interesting avenues for future research are this looking more deeply at this sense of belonging and integration that motivates people to try and change these citizenship practices, the outsider image as leverage and the reclamation of that identity, and jus solis as a mark of modernity, meaning that as there is more globalization and transnational processes at work, jus solis is becoming increasingly popular, and most world powers are considering changing their naturalization processes to reflect this. This project was made possible by the Eugene Lang Opportunity Award and the Global Studies Travel Award, and I wanted to thank Deacon Albro, who's not here today, unfortunately, but for his support and guidance, and to Lara Palermo for her facilitation of this process and this panel. Thank you all so much.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Mohanty. As I mentioned before, I'm a sophomore at Lang, and I'm majoring in politics and minoring in screen studies. And my presentation today will be slightly different from my co-panelists. Instead of talking about research I did, instead I will be talking about a set of experiences I had when I was interning in Frankfurt, Germany, in the summer of 2017. Frankfurt's right there. It's in the state of Hessen. I don't know if you can see it. I was working with two organizations that aim to help and support migrants and refugees who were entering Frankfurt. The first place that I worked at was the Refugee Council of Hessen, which you can see in the top right corner. And that organization aimed to provide legal advocacy and representation for refugees who had just entered Germany and were applying for the status of refugee or asylum status. It also served as a liaison between smaller initiatives that worked within Frankfurt and the larger state government of Hessen. And the second place that I interned at was the Multi-Generational House, which was a local Frankfurt-based initiative that provided services for refugees and migrant communities living in and around the city, services such as resume building, helping refugees and migrants prepare for job interviews or interviews that they might need when applying for refugee and asylum status. There was also a pre-K and a kindergarten, but the work that I did at each of these organizations is at the Refugee Council. I did mostly research, but I was able to have one experience that I will share with you in a moment. And at the Multi-Generational House, I worked with a group of kids around ages 7 to 16 called I-Klasse, which means integration class. And the purpose of I-Klasse was it's the summer program that helps these kids who ages 7 to 16 who had just entered Germany or Frankfurt within the last 4 to 6 months, help them build their German language skills so they could be adequately prepared for the fall school year and attending class with people of their age group. These kids came from all over the world. They were kids from Eastern Europe. There was a girl from Eritrea and Africa, children from Egypt, and those children all came to Frankfurt as migrants. However, there were these two kids, these two boys, who I will speak of later in my presentation as well, ages 12 and 13, who were refugees from Syria and cousins. So my weeks were divided between working at these two organizations. And here's just a graph to show you just the general distribution of asylum seekers and refugees in Germany. Hessen is right here. So everything I knew about the refugee crisis had come from my politics courses at the New School and everything that I saw in the news. And from what I knew is that there was civil unrest and it caused the forced migration of roughly 13.5 million people and counting, which resulted in the largest humanitarian crisis of the century. And it was all over the news during the summer of 2015, as I'm sure you guys all know. It was on CNN, MSNBC, and here I chose a couple of European outlets. I mostly chose ones from the UK because the headlines were in English, so you could read them. But this didn't enter our public discourse until 2014, 2015. However, as Marius had mentioned, the crisis goes back to all the way in 2011, and people started leaving Syria as early as then. However, they were just going to neighboring countries, as you mentioned, like Lebanon and Jordan. And it didn't enter our public discourse until the European Union started accepting refugees in 2014 and 2015, which resulted in what the European Union refers to as their migrant crisis. And I remember seeing all of these headlines. Here's an example of one of Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel, opening the borders and welcoming 1 million refugees. That number in and of itself is not necessarily accurate, but she was being lauded as this hero and encouraging other European Union countries to follow in her lead. And she declared that it was Germany's national duty, and it resulted in Germany eventually opening their borders to refugees in 2015. But I am instead going to share with you some observations I had based off of my experiences. I'm going to first start with the ones that I had working at the council. So as I mentioned previously, I mostly did research, but I was also given the opportunity to visit a refugee accommodation. This is not the one that I visited. I was taking photos for my organization, but I was not allowed to share those photos. But this is one that was in Berlin to kind of represent visually how these accommodations were set up and how they looked. It's essentially, well, this is kind of a fourth of what the facility that I went to actually looked like, but it's consists of these large open rooms where these people are kind of given these boxes, and there's about 10 people per space, very little privacy. And this is mostly where unaccompanied men were. The facility that I visited acts as kind of like a role model for the state of Hessen. Was the nicest one that I've seen, especially in comparison to these photos. The first photo was from Berlin, sorry, and this one is from one in southern Germany. The facility that I had the opportunity to visit was much nicer. There was actually a space that was separate for women and children. It provided, as Marius mentioned, it's really important for women to have a space for themselves, especially support for their traumas that they might experience during the journey that are unique to the ones that the unaccompanied male minors might experience. So the facility that I visited actually really worked on improving the conditions for women specifically. And another service or aspect of the facility was this cafeteria that was completely owned and run by female refugees. And when I was there, I got to sit and have lunch with them, and I got to talk to them, and it wasn't that easy because I didn't have that much German language knowledge going into this. I mean, I prepared, obviously, but I wasn't fluent by any means, and they obviously were not completely fluent in German either. But given that a lot of these people made a journey through Afghanistan, they have some knowledge of Urdu and my knowledge of Hindi and their knowledge of English and my knowledge of German, we were able to have enough of a conversation. But I believe also this is something I found while doing this internship, that there are ways to communicate with people that go beyond language. So I was able to have lunch with them, and it didn't really feel right or comfortable to necessarily ask them about, oh, so what was your experience like being a refugee? Instead, they expressed to me some of the dissatisfaction they felt when coming to Germany, not just with the fact that the asylum process was slow, they were having trouble finding jobs, they faced a lot of sexism even within the facility itself. The things that we ended up talking about were much more lighthearted. They didn't like Germany's food. They thought the food in Germany was horrible, which is something that we bonded over because it's very true. The other thing that we kind of talked about, which I found very heartwarming, was that Bollywood is very big in the Middle East and lots of South Asia. So they were really tickled by the fact that I was Indian. And there was this one little girl, she was about 6 years old, and she had every single popular Bollywood dance and song, all the choreography down, all the lyrics down, even though she didn't speak Hindi and she had no idea what she was saying. And she performed them all for me, and it was quite endearing. But of course, that's not the whole reason why I was there. I was there for work. So I wrote up my findings about the conditions of the facility to see if they were on par with the standards that were in place and set by the Hessen government. And then I gave those to my boss. That was essentially why I was there, but that's not what I got most out of my experience being there. Here's a photograph of, sorry, I'll actually get back to that in a second. The other organization that I worked at that I mentioned was the integration class. I worked with these group of kids, and the work that I did there was supposed to help facilitate their English language learning alongside them learning German. They believed that it would be good for them to have some knowledge of both going into school. But I kind of acted more as a summer camp counselor, it felt like. So these two boys, who I actually ran into at the facility, they came to Syria as unaccompanied minors, which was something I learned during this project that we had the students do, which was an art show, where these students or these kids who I was working with were asked to visually represent in drawings or photographs, or whatever medium they chose, the journey that they made from their home country and how they eventually ended up in Frankfurt, Germany. So these two boys who, over the course of the month, I'd come to know as being like very mischievous, I was actually able to understand where exactly they'd come from in a way that I don't think I would have been able to from, say, a news article that had been published by BBC or CNN. And I learned that they had left Syria together as unaccompanied minors because they had gotten news that their neighbors had been killed. So their families took out loans and were able to get them enough money to get them into Afghanistan, from which they were smuggled through until they eventually took a boat to Greece, where they were then separated. And they both wound up in Hungary together, but they were still separated. And as unaccompanied minors, being separated from the family that you left your home with is quite scary. But thankfully, when they were in Germany, they were able to be reunited. And now they actually share a room at one of the facilities, the housing facilities for unaccompanied minors. And they're very happy. And of course, the journey was incredibly traumatic for them. However, they're very happy that they have each other now. So the result of the experiences I had is that I was not only able to see how the crisis manifested on a national scale or on the state level, but also on the local level, and even more importantly for me personally, was on the individual level. Because prior to coming to Germany, all I knew about the refugees were that they were just this faceless mass of people whose livelihoods were being determined for them, whose stories were being told for them, and whose futures were being negotiated for them by these outside players. And I learned through the course of not just my research that I did at my internships, that they were also active agents in their own lives. And it helps, I think, understanding people on an individual level and how these political catastrophes might affect them individually, helps facilitate a conversation that they are actually people and they're actually able to be agents in their own change in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways that I didn't even feel like I was able to really grasp when I was working at even the Refugee Council, where a lot of the work I did was research and policy and law-based. Lastly, I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, in the United States, and especially in this liberal arts institution, we have this idea that the personal is political, which is incredibly important, but one of the most valuable things that I got while working at these organizations was also that the political is also incredibly personal, and that doesn't take away from the fact that it is political nonetheless. In fact, it just makes it more important and more valuable. So I didn't really stick to my slides very well, but here's another photo, refugees protesting against the very fact that Marius was talking about. A lot of, or maybe you didn't mention this, sorry, a lot of families getting separated and then being reunited, which we talked about with these two boys. It's an ongoing crisis, especially for Germany in particular. However, thankfully, these two boys were able to be reunited, which was good to see. And here's a refugee camp, which differs from the accommodations. The refugee camps are where refugees temporarily stayed, while the accommodations were more permanent. We were a more permanent facility for refugees to stay while they were looking for jobs and while they were going through the system. And lastly, I'd like to thank the two organizations that I worked at, the Refugee Council and the Multi-Generational House. I'd like to thank Lang CESJ for giving me the summer internship grant. I'd like to thank Eugene Lang. I'd also like to thank Laura Palermo for being an integral part in organizing this panel and helping me personally with my presentation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cassidy Nelson, and I will be presenting my thesis research, which is entitled Argentina Llamando, Mapping Grassroots Refugee Resettlement. So, to provide a little bit of background as to how I got interested in this topic, I've been lucky enough to spend nearly a year and a half of my college education living, farming, and studying in rural Ecuador and urban Havana, Cuba. And these experiences abroad, coupled with curriculum in the Global Studies department at the New School, have led me to complex questions of colonial monocropping, dependency, and global power relations, and in particular, the ways in which communities can create localized community-based solutions in response to these global challenges. So, as we've been talking about, one of the greatest challenges facing the global community today is displacement, which is at an all-time record high. And as of 2016, there were 65.6 million displaced people around the globe. And that makes about 20 displacements per minute. As the effects of climate change intensify, so do both intra and international conflicts, meaning it is likely we will see even higher levels in the coming years. So historically, the UNHCR, or the UN Agency on Refugees, has utilized 3 durable solutions to manage resettlement, or to manage displacement. The first is repatriation, which means refugees are returned to their country of origin. There's also local integration, which means integration into a neighboring country of asylum, like Greece, for example. And then there's resettlement, which is resettlement into a third country, more further removed from the first country of asylum. And of these solutions, resettlement has historically been the least utilized, and in fact, only 1% of the world's refugees have ever been resettled. And this is because the process is rather arduous and involves a substantial financial cost and intricate planning on the part of the host country. Given this, few countries have historically been willing or able to resettle refugees. And of these traditional refugee resettlement countries, many are now moving towards increasingly anti-immigrant isolationist policies and diverting refugees from their own borders including by funding plans like this one to send refugees to, quote, emerging resettlement countries. And partially as a result of this, the number of countries offering resettlement programs has grown from just 14 in 2005 to 37 in 2016. Most of these programs are still in the developmental phase and are relatively small in scale, but they're likely to continue to grow as prolonged conflicts like Syria show little hope for either of the other durable solutions, either repatriation or local integration. Which brings me to Argentina, which as of 2017 has resettled 318 Syrian refugees. And Argentina was not the first country in Latin America to create a national resettlement program. In fact, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay have all done the same to varying degrees of success. But what attracted me to Argentina and what has garnered a certain amount of global attention is Argentina's private sponsorship model, which in many ways was created to emulate Canada's successful model. And what this means is that instead of a top-down federally funded resettlement program, Program Syria relies on the contributions of private citizens, civil society, religious and ethnic organizations, and NGOs to fill that role. And in the Argentina case, they're called llamantes, or callers, and these are these individual sponsors. And these callers facilitate resettlement on various aspects, from making case selections to community integration, and they provide a range of housing, medical, and educational necessities for the first year or so of resettlement. So my goal with this research became to map these interactions between organizations to see what they were doing and how they were doing it, with the intention of making visible their contributions towards creating community-based solutions to complex global challenges like displacement. So in order to do this, I conducted archival research. I sifted through national and provincial periodicals, as well as government documents, UNHCR documents, and I conducted several semi-formal interviews with community leaders who were helping with this resettlement process. And when I spoke to these community leaders, I asked them questions about their organizations, the challenges that they face, the state support that they receive, and their goals for the future of the program. And what I found was, and this is a sort of a map of some of the, not exhaustive by any means, but some of the places in the country where resettlement has begun. So what I found in this research was that the first communities to accept refugees were those with an existing Arab Argentine population. And Argentina actually has a significant Syrian Lebanese population. It's in fact the second largest in Latin America. And this population is mostly concentrated in the northwestern provinces of the country. As you saw from that map, that's also the same area in which Program Syria began. So upon creation in 2014, Program Syria required all llamantes demonstrate a familial link, so maybe a cousin, some sort of family connection, to the refugees they were sponsoring. So it makes sense that these Syrian Argentine communities in the Northwest would be the first resettlement sites in the country. And it also accounts for a relatively slow start, as it was happening just on individual connections from the beginning. However, that began to change in 2016 and 2017, when Program Syria expanded to include humanitarian groups as llamantes and removed the familial link requirement, allowing any citizen or group with sufficient resources to become a caller. And during the same time, Program Syria started receiving support from the UNHCR and that emerging resettlement joint mechanism that I mentioned earlier. And these changes amounted to a significant influx of Syrian refugees in the country. And in fact, 155 of the total 318 were resettled in 2017 alone. So, amidst these changes, a group of community members in San Luis pressured the provincial government to provide funding for Syrian refugees to resettle within their province. And in 2016, the government agreed and declared San Luis the first calling state in Argentina. So sort of taking that individual model and making it into a state model. So under this agreement, the state government agreed to share responsibility with individual and family sponsors by helping secure employment opportunities, healthcare, and education. And they do this in part by matching refugees and llamantes with what they call active adherents, or individuals, institutions, and families that can volunteer services and resources. And these contributions can be anything from a free Spanish class to donated apartments. And this is all carried out through their online matching platform, which looks like this, in which active adherents can apply on this website with whatever resources they would like to contribute, and they'll be from there matched with a refugee or a llamante who's looking for that resource. So this has been just a microscopic snapshot into the evolving and expanding processes of refugee resettlement in Argentina. And it should be considered merely a point of departure for continued research by both myself and others. And in fact, over the summer, I'll be participating in the International Field Program in Buenos Aires, Argentina, thanks to the Lang Opportunity Award. And then I would also like to thank Alexandra Delano, my thesis teacher, who's been a massive help in this project, Amanda Zadorian, who's also assisting with my thesis, Laura, and Maren, Uma, and Marios for making this all possible. So I'm really grateful to all of you for having come to see this today, so thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
For your paper and also for the ones that came out of the UN, how would that move if it moved forward into?
Yes. Okay. So, so my first experience to policy was last summer when I was part of the United Nations Summer Study Program. There, we were a group of 5 students, and we developed a policy paper that has addressed integration processes for a different demographic, of course. What our professor did, the person who was supervising that policy paper, was that once it was finished, he submitted that to the United Nations Counter-Executive Terrorism Directorate. But of course, the individual needs to have the proper connections with regards to the government and for example, the United Nations or the state. So in my case, I have a couple of connections that I know that I can utilize as an individual so as to put that paper into action. Of course, I can't guarantee that this is going to happen, but I'll do my best. As a young individual, I think it's my responsibility to propose such actions and to do my best. So yeah, thank you very much.
So I was curious, so Cassidy, the model that you were talking about in Argentina, and I'm wondering if any of the other 3 of you in the communities that you saw those same kinds of community-based models as one viable approach to, I mean, I guess it's different with Maren, with the groups you're talking about, but in terms of refugee resettlement, with resettling refugees either in Greece or in Germany, they're kind of more community-based as opposed to state top-down.
Yeah, I can go first. Can you hear me? I need to use this. Okay. So in Germany in particular, Germany's government really prides itself on providing a lot of social benefits, and that is over the course of the years in terms of the evolution of Germany's policy regarding refugees and asylum seekers has evolved to a state where the German government on the national and state level are mostly in charge of allocating the resources that refugees would need. However, there is community-based stuff, similarly to like the organization that I worked at, the second one, the Multi-Generational House, is a local organization that aims to help support the existence of migrants and refugees in various aspects who were living in Frankfurt, but not necessarily on a legal, or not necessarily on like the level of what Cassidy was talking about. Instead, there's actually a lot of contention around the role of migrants and refugees in Germany, especially given Germany's rising right-wing group, both politically and also just culturally and socially.
Yeah. So in Greece, it's a little bit different because I think that the Greek society wasn't able to be mobilized the same way that it happened with Argentina because of the containment policy that exists right now. I mean, definitely it was much stronger at the beginning of the crisis, but when you have all refugees being contained at very specific islands, and those islands are tiny communities, they're very small communities, the rest of the country wasn't as immersed to the true crisis and what was really happening. And if you just look at the Greek news, what was happening is that the government decided to lower the taxes at those 5 specific islands as a form of giving something back to the Greek communities there, as an incentive in a way for them to properly support refugees, which I personally think that it's a very problematic form of policy. And I think that what is going to happen is that after at the beginning of 2019, where STIA as a program will become part of the Greek welfare system, I think that that may be the starting point for similar initiatives such as the one that Cassidy presented to start growing, where the entire country would start becoming more immersed into this idea. So, yeah.
I just wanted to add real quick that it's really important to think about scale. I mean, I mentioned it's only 318 that have been resettled, and I think it's an impressive model as it is now in many ways, but it is still very much emerging and definitely doesn't have this sort of quantity that we're talking about in Greece or these surrounding countries of first asylum. So it's a very different case and should be taken sort of as it is, as something that's emerging and sort of an interesting case study, but very different contexts.
Italy is an interesting part, and I just wanted to mention this because although the situation is different, there are refugees in Italy, and a large majority of them end up passing on like similar situation to Greece into other European countries. But one of the big arguments that a lot of these students have made is that if they were citizens and if these processes were more open, then they would be able to better assist the government in the refugee crisis and in handling this. And I actually, as part of my fieldwork, ended up going to a house that has been put together by the community, and it's run as a place where unaccompanied minors can can be housed, they can go to school, they get a lot of assistance, they have activities, and that helps them integrate into the school system more effectively. They have role models that are immigrants, children who have been born in Italy, and that model seems to be really effective and has generated a lot of funding from NGOs and from some state and like provincial organizations. So I think that this model of community to community organizing is really effective, like Cassie was saying, on a personal basis, and it would be even more effective in Italy if these processes were naturalized.
I think yes, one quick question.
Yes, I just wondered if you could comment based on your experience, the language which we use to talk about these issues. I noticed the panel refers to, lately at least, to migration, but you use the word refugee rather than migrant for the most part. And that's one of the live controversies with respect to language. How have your experiences shaped your understanding of what language to use?
In the naming of this, we really wanted to find something that stretched to fit all of our topics. And although refugees are a form of forced displacement or forced migration, it still has that element of international movement. So that's why we chose that, just as a brief entry point.
I think also I tried to address this very briefly, and I go more into this into my work, but I chose in all the literature that I wrote to use the term immigrant/migrant to sort of avoid this idea that because they're not citizens, they are not contributing members of the host society, and that has often been something that nativists in the countries that I was looking at have sort of rejected them and said like, oh, they're part of the migrant crisis and this sort of thing, but they refer to themselves as immigrants, and I refer to them as immigrants because I felt like they fit the definition of immigrant in every aspect, except for in some ways being legally documented or becoming a citizen of that country. And also, I think we chose the specific term migration to look really at the local elements of this and try to, as Uma said in her presentation, like really highlight the fact that these are people and that these are local processes that are happening and not just these like huge global flows that we hear about a lot.
Thank you very much. I think that we should stop here. I thank the panelists. I think it's really great.